Dr. Lopez, Their Excellencies, Honourable Representatives of the Government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. And if I may speak in my own ancient language, Agili Korar Fad is Moranochus Taram Ven Shaliv, a Hala na Africa, Kianar Sterul, Commission Aknamirt an Africa, na Nationentaha, in Addis Ababa na Ethiopia, Shamadara, Quarter in Africa, Mar Utrone Her. And I translate. It is a great pleasure to be here with you all in Africa whole, the historic headquarters of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, here in Addis Ababa, on what is my second visit to Africa as President of Ireland. And may I thank Dr. Lopez. I thank you for your kind words of welcome. And indeed, you paid us the courtesy just recently of a visit to Ireland, and I am deeply grateful for the warm hospitality you are extending today to me and to our Minister of State for Development and Trade Promotion, Sean Sherlock, and to the entire Irish delegation who are accompanying me. My visit to the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia is the first leg of an African visit, which will also include the Republic of Malawi and the Republic of South Africa. The purpose of these visits is to reinforce Ireland-Ethiopia relations with each of the three countries, but it is also to listen and encounter the new departures underway or being considered by Africans for the future of their people. And it is an opportunity for me as President of Ireland to manifest Ireland's desire to expand and deepen our cooperation with Africa generally, building on our long-standing ties of diplomatic exchanges, missionary activity, development cooperation, and above all else, friendship. Indeed, relationships with African countries have long formed an important strand of Ireland's foreign policy, and the significance of those relationships is increasing due to the intrinsic global nature of the most pressing challenges of our times, such as climate change, food security, poverty reduction, and the fate of refugees and asylum seekers, the upsurge in religious intolerance, and of course, the urgent threats posed by the current Ebola crisis. It is my profound conviction that any authentic engagement with the global interdependence that binds our peoples together, which is the theme of my address this morning, cannot rest solely on any self-interested or pragmatic stance. For example, any notion that we, Europeans, must help fix problems beyond our borders, lest the poor, the hungry, the countryless, the vengeful of the world will ultimately break through these borders. Any deep-seated recognition of our interdependence across continents must be firmly grounded. I contend that it must be grounded in a shared ethical consciousness, a vision of socio-economic development that places human flourishing at its heart. My hope in this new century, therefore, is that we will endeavour together to build a cooperative, caring, and non-exploitative civilization based on the firm foundations of recognizing each people's own institutions and traditions, experiences and memories, including those memories that will inevitably recall wounds, failures, and opportunities lost, but will also be based on a recognition of the solidarity that binds us together as human beings, and an acknowledgement of the responsibility we share for our fragile planet and the dignity of all who dwell on it. It is fitting then that I should start my visit to Africa here in Ethiopia, the cradle of humanity. On Sunday, my first appointment in Addis Ababa was at the National Museum to see Australopithecus afarensis, also called Dinknesh, the wondrous one. in her Ethiopian homeland, and better known to many of us as Lucy. This 1.1 meter tall skeleton of a female estimated to have lived 3.2 million years ago symbolizes the debunking of the pseudoscience of 19th century European racial anthropologists and white supremacists. The discovery made by Donald Johanson in 1974 thus changed forever scientific understanding of human origins and constituted the principal milestone on the road to the epoch-making discovery that the first woman was not a white Eve, but an irretrievably black Eve, to borrow a term employed by Reginald Dumas in his book on Haiti. We Irish people were never, of course, proud proponents of racial supremacy theories, and indeed, as Dr. Lopez has said, over the course of our history, we were more often than not on the receiving end of such, the victims of imperial notions of racial difference and superiority from the 17th century onwards in particular, when a stereotypical package of attributes was directed at our people with the purpose of justifying the superiority of the colonizers' civilization over the colonized. And this perhaps suggests, in a way, it is a partial explanation of why the Irish can be prone to identify so quickly, in sympathy and imagination, with those people who strive for their freedom, for their dignity. Indeed, Ireland's national history and your own national histories in Africa, however distinct they may be, are ones that chime, and why in your recollections, I understand too, we hear echoes of our own past. We indeed, as Dr. Lopez has said, we Irish experienced, in addition to the scourges of colonization, that of hunger, the terror of the hungry grass, as Irish poet Donna MacDonagh put it. It is no surprise then that our memories of those terrible events of the Irish 19th century famine, on Gortamore in our own language, the Great Hunger, the year of the potato failure, for we have found it very difficult even to put a name on it. And we recall that and those dark years and the massive emigration that followed. And they inform Ireland's enduring commitment to development cooperation with ethics with its African partners. In the 20th century, the Irish people also, as you have heard, had to struggle for independence. And we endured the subsequent harrowing destabilization of civil war. Thus, the memory of our emancipatory struggles continues today to inform our outlook on the world, our interpretation of the narratives and projects of others, the vindication of the dignity and freedom of individuals and the peoples of other nations, the importance of justice and compassion. These are there in the bedrock of our values as a nation, and we know too how difficult it is to secure or vindicate those values that might have motivated a struggle for independence in a post-independence experience. Ireland's emancipatory struggles have drawn always from an internationalism that remains important to us today. One of the figures of the struggle for Irish freedom was Roger Casement, who was a diplomat in the British Foreign Office, dedicated much effort to investigating the brutal and dehumanizing effects of colonial rule in what was called the Belgian Congo at the turn of the 20th century. And that was at a time when few questioned the righteousness of European colonial empires. And in Casement's work, we can find the seeds of the contemporary language of universal human rights, a defense of the fundamental equality and dignity of all human beings, regardless of color, gender, race, or creed. And then as to human labor itself, his writings also contain a strong call to adhere to the development of humane working and living conditions for the people. Roger Casement's rejection of colonialism, his revulsion at its practices, brought to an extreme in a continent like Africa, led him to embrace the path of the Irish National Revolution and, of course, ultimately to his death. And at his trial for treason in front of a British court, he said, "Self-government is our right, a thing born in us at birth, a thing no more to be doled out to us or withheld from us by another people than the right to life itself." I think of Roger Casement and many men and women like him whenever I read the opening lines of the solemn charter adopted at the opening summit of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which half a century later invoked, I quote, "the inalienable right of all people to control their own destiny." And indeed it is impossible for me to stand in this impressive building, Africa Hall, without thinking of those early days of African unity and recalling in my mind the 32 delegations arriving here for the first summit in May 1963. Africa was not entirely free then. Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Angola had yet to achieve their independence, and it would not be until 1994 that the first universal suffrage elections would be held in South Africa. Back in 1963, the leaders of newly independent countries saw the need for multilateral institutions to promote understanding and solidarity between the peoples of Africa. They understood the importance of cooperation between states and to respond to their people's aspirations for democracy, peace, security, and social, economic, and cultural development. There was no clear consensus, however, for as Emperor Haile Selassie put it, on the how and the what of this union. Is it to be in form federal, confederable, or unitary? Is the sovereignty of individual states to be reduced, and if so, by how much and in what areas? But 50 years later, this debate as to the form, extent, and pace of regional integration, of course, remains a matter of debate, is unsettled. Conflicts of leadership between the OAU's member states, armed conflicts between neighboring countries, disregard, even at times contempt for democracy and the rights of citizens in too many countries have shattered the promises of regional integration. And looking back on those first 2 decades since 1963, Julius Kambarage Nyerere reflected with a saddened heart in these words: "We spoke and acted as if, given the opportunity for self-government, we would quickly create utopias. Instead, injustice, even tyranny, is rampant. Yet none of us should be defeated by aims or projects not realized. 5 decades is a short time. It is but a moment in the history of this great continent, and African leaders have achieved much in those 50 years. Decolonization and the fight against apartheid South Africa, 2 of the OAU's main objectives, have been completed. In 2002, the African Union succeeded the OAU, and the new generation of leaders who work together within this African Union have inherited and are endowed with the crucial transformational task of shepherding the path from independence to a new form of interdependence. Today, we in Ireland exercise our shared sovereignty in the pursuit of a real union of European states. The union we seek is a union that puts the aim of social cohesion on an equal footing with that of competitiveness as an economic region. A European Union of citizens committed to solidarity between each other and the solidarity with the ethical aspirations of a truly global community. It might seem then superficially that a country like Ireland that spent centuries struggling for independence would choose to pool its sovereignty in a broader union within a matter of decades. Yet I believe that this decision to pool our hard-earned sovereignty with other European Union member states is a choice which ultimately enhanced our sovereignty, a move that defined a new role for us in Europe, and through that with the wider world. It provided us with new economic opportunities within an expanded regional single market. Yes, it opened up new horizons for our citizens, and nearer home brought a new maturity to our relations with the United Kingdom, our former colonial power. It has been a remarkable turnaround, which happened within the space of a generation. My father fought for Irish independence, and in April of this year, I became the first head of that independent state, Ireland, to accept an invitation to pay a state visit to our close neighbour, the United Kingdom. Today, Ireland and Britain are equal partners within the European Union, friends who trade together, who are able to revisit their common past with openness and mutual respect, and to work, for example, together to support the reconciliation process in Northern Ireland, recognising that that settlement achieved in Northern Ireland between Dublin, Belfast and London brought with it a new set of possibilities for building on our independence project. As we say in Irish, féidearachtaí gan teorann. I believe that such a constructive vision of their interdependence can today guide the regional cooperation between African countries as they face into the challenges brought about by the new century. It can also serve as a basis for concerted action between African states and their partners in the wider world towards achieving social and economic progress for all of our global citizens. The scale of the global challenges we face together requires not only a recovery of those impulses of the past towards a new world, it requires also new scholarship, new will that will generate new relationships with each other and our fragile planet. For over the last couple of decades, the world has undergone a reorganization that gave supremacy to dangerous notions as to the efficiency and sustainability of the self-regulated market, and that led to a shrinking of state action. This shift was underpinned by a very narrow scholarship that in turn generated models of economics which became hegemonic, one single way. The global financial meltdown of 2008 has revealed an enormous institutional and regulatory void in coordinating and governing markets so that they might operate for the common good. And from these failed paradigms, we must now shake free. It is important that we reaffirm strongly today the significance of multilateral institutions such as the United Nations and of regional organizations such as the European Union and the African Union, in safeguarding the needs and expectations not just of their representative member states, but above all of the citizens. And if this is to happen, it is important that our young people have the opportunity for a pluralist education. That is their right, a pluralist education that enables critical scholarship and that will serve as a basis for a diverse range of policy options that will usher in this new world. Dear friends, the last 50 years, they might have passed like the blink of an eye for Lucy, but for the peoples of Africa, they've been of fundamental importance. Africa's growth performance has improved dramatically since the year 2000, and this has been underpinned by a number of factors, such as the commitment to peaceful democratic elections in ever more countries, strengthening domestic demand associated with rising incomes and urbanization, increased public spending, particularly on infrastructure, intensification of trade and investment ties with emerging economies, and for some countries, abundant harvests. Yet we must never forget that the origin of cities itself is located in the rural surplus in their hinterland, that is the source of the city in history. Today, Africa is at a crucial juncture of its development. The discourse has moved on from war and disadvantage to debates about vindicating human rights and the nature of citizenship in culturally diverse settings. As Leopold Sédar Senghor put it, Africa is not an idea, it is a knot of realities. Realities that can be shaped in order to deliver human progress and sustainable development. And African leaders working together within the African Union, civil servants and organizations such as this Economic Commission for Africa, civil society activists across the continents, are wisely taking note of the lessons that can be drawn from the hegemonic models of a recent economics that has failed, both here and in our countries, and in that they are wise. They are wise in endeavoring to produce their own forms of thinking, new forms of thinking, humanely derived, generating alternative models of development that are socially, culturally, and ethically grounded. The evolving global order of this 21st century thus presents Africans with many opportunities, and of course also with challenges, but ones which if they are met with effective and concerted policies at the regional and global level, can lead to positive socio-economic transformation, a transformation we need at global level. The first of these challenges remains, in my view, that of food security. And indeed the continent's population, as it is expected to double from just over 1 billion to over 2 billion people by 2050. And the most fundamental task of finding appropriate ways to feed such an expanding population is of course rendered ever more critical in this century by the additional and largely uncharted problems posed by climate change. The issue of food security concerns all of our countries. And crucially, in facing this issue, it is important to consider and make a reflection on the practices of those interests who are involved in the global infrastructure of, for example, commodity trading. Commodity trading that is governed by powerful global financial markets. And the question of deciding if speculation on food commodities is an acceptable practice is a moral question, I believe. One whose resolution cannot be led by the whims of the market. It must rather be the object of multilateral regulation based on a shared ethical consciousness of the special status of farming and food products upon which hinges the survival of so many in so many nations. My friend Professor Howard Stein, who contributed to the recent 2014 unique annual economic report on industrial policy, convincingly argued in a 2012 paper he presented at a conference at Trinity College Dublin. He argued against speculation on food commodities as follows. Commodity markets are being driven not by fundamentals of producers and end users, but by other factors. Among other things, commodities are seen as good hedge when the value of the dollar falls, which lowers the value of global commodities in non-dollar terms. In 2011, for example, it is estimated that 61% of the wheat futures market was held by speculators, compared to only 12% in the mid-90s, prior to the deregulation which was swept across our world. And while African commodity exporting economies may have benefited greatly from recent sustained increases in the price of some primary commodities, I believe that it is timely and important to ask if such rents can be relied upon as an enduring engine of growth and development. How can African countries and their partners beyond Africa tackle the power of financial agents who have become such key players in driving speculation and fluctuations in commodity markets? Whose interests do these markets really benefit, and whose needs do they cater for? Such questions will have to be addressed sooner rather than later if we are ever to experience a form of globalization that we may call ethical. They cannot be met with silence or inactivity on the part of multilateral institutions if they are seriously concerned about the survival of the poorest on our planet. And as one explores the relations between agriculture, food, and security, the triptych chosen by the African Union as its theme for 2014, the question of access to land emerges as a pivotal issue, not least because of its vital relevance to the survival of the poorest in Africa's rural areas. It is an issue that I have discussed in a previous speech at Trinity College Dublin Africa Day earlier this year. I said I think it will be a theme to which I will return when I speak at Lilongwe University of Agriculture and Natural Resources in Malawi next week. But I believe that it deserves just a mention this morning as we reflect upon the challenges facing contemporary Africa. I would like to avail of this occasion to salute the United Nations decision to declare 2014 the International Year of Family Farming. The need to relocate family farming at the center of African national agendas, including trade policies, is all the more pressing in light of the scale of the current phenomenon of land grabbing, whereby large swathes of the countryside that are considered idle are being sold or transferred through long-term leases to usually foreign investors. There is no question that the demographic challenge, in particular, the need to provide for growing demand for the continent's mushrooming cities, does indeed call for a proactive policy response. Yes, it is a concern that must be expressed. Are those massive transfers of land organized in the name of the modernization of African agriculture, and also sometimes quoted as more efficient food production strategies, to be pursued at the expense of the food security of the local farming populations? It is my belief that if supported by appropriate policies at local, regional, and global level, new models can proliferate beyond or as an alternative to the expansion of large plantations. And as we reflect on the future of African farming finally, it is perhaps appropriate to critically consider just one example, the model of Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto, his model of land parcelization, which has mesmerized so many policymakers over the last few decades. Indeed, Dr. de Soto's approach appears particularly problematic from the point of view of rural common property resources, resources that are shared, which have fluid boundaries and which are required to be continuously adapted to fit people's social needs. Ones that are rarely exclusive to one person, but involve instead multiple layers of relative rights that make the philosophical consumption that we have in our nature an urge to cooperate that is stronger than the urge to put the stamp of personal property on resources that are shared. But uncritical acceptance of such a model as that of Dr. de Soto is capable of visiting the most devastating consequences on rural families. And what strikes me most is the intellectual blind spot in his conception. His formal property has as its main characteristic the assumption that of individual conception, that of individual private ownership. Its primary function is the generation of capital through its use as potential collateral for loans from private institutions. Other functions, long lodged in African history, such as the significance of land for the social continuity of groups, for ideas of kinship and descendancy, for intergenerational solidarity, are ignored. Not only in this instance, but more generally, I suggest, we must urgently seek alternatives to the reductive, narrow imagination of mainstream models of development such as de Soto's. Land tenure has been the subject of too many disastrous experiments in engineering, both physical and social. It is now time, I believe, for us to turn to Africans to imagine and craft inclusive agricultural development policies for Africans of not only existing but future generations. Models that are grounded in a recognition of the need to feed an expanding regional population while also taking care of a fragile and exhaustible natural environment, and taking on board the heritage, the vast heritage of indigenous wisdom and the wealth of practices and conceptions that have connected people to their land. A profusion of ideas and projects are already underway, and many alternative models are indeed being developed across Africa, which accommodate the complex nature of rights in many rural contexts, such as, for example, the concept of adverse possession as it is being elaborated in South Africa. Interestingly, many of these projects are underpinned by a vision of rights as being communal as well as individual. And in his own time, Julius Nyerere had a keen sense of the tension between individual and collective conceptions of rights, and the need to find the right balance between the two. And in his words, in a speech he gave in 1960, he said, "Having come into contact with a civilization which has overemphasized the freedom of the individual, we are in fact faced with one of the big problems of Africa and the modern world. Our problem is just this: how to get the benefits of European society, benefits that have been brought about by an organization based upon the individual, and yet retain Africans' own structure of society, in which the individual is a member of a kind of fellowship. Community solidarity, of course, is present in a myriad of forms in contemporary Africa, and Ireland is proud to support, for example, Ethiopia's Productive Safety Nets program, which encourages members of local communities to give of their time and labour for a set number of days in support of public works, the public world. And whether we call it Ubuntu, Umuganda, Harambe, Debo, or more prosaically, the Productive Safety Nets program, there are so many ancient and modern expressions of cooperation and interdependence across this continent that point towards a different way of living and a different way of viewing the world around us. In Ireland, in Europe, and globally, we have paid the price of an excess of individualization, for a confusion between individual freedom and pursuit of self-interest, a reduction of the fundamental philosophical concept of freedom to the freedom of unregulated and unreliable and unaccountable markets. And against the current trends in increasing commodification of life, I believe that it is vital that we recover a sense of the public world, so essential to our lives together. Ladies and gentlemen, today this public world is also threatened by the upsurge of intolerance here in Africa and beyond. And this is not a new threat, of course. In his speech to the Union of African Unity in 1963, Leopold Sédar Senghor said, "We must begin by rejecting all fanaticism, whether racial, religious, or linguistic. Then and then only can we define our aim lucidly." The scale of the contemporary challenge is reflected in the presence on African soil of so many soldiers from the rest of the world who are engaged in seeking to prevent hotbeds of conflict from emerging or escalating, conflicts often fueled, indeed, by the misuse of resources. Many of these conflicts thrive on poverty and a new geography of inequalities, which sees the path of prosperous African centres, many of them connected to the maritime trade routes of our contemporary globalization, diverge from that of interior regions, which descend to being enclaves of misery and revolt, enclaves that are plagued by unemployment and lack of opportunity. Here, as in Europe, we know how unemployment, and in particular endemic youth unemployment, can feed rancor and frustration. Ireland has one of the youngest populations in Europe, but of course this continent's population is incomparably younger. Africa's formidable demographic dynamism is available to express itself in the fields of citizenship, education, economic innovation, and social transformation. The key challenge, therefore, is one that we also currently face in Europe: how to create jobs. jobs that are real jobs, that honour the dignity that is required in work, and to do so in particular for the young. And this, of course, ties into a more fundamental question. Real growth. What is real growth? To what extent are indicators such as gross domestic product, of which we know that they have fared rather particularly high in Africa over the last couple of decades, to what extent is it an appropriate measure of social development? In that 1963 speech of his, to which I referred, Senghor expressed his view on this question in the following terms. The aim we must assign, which we do assign, to our action can obviously only be the very aim which other nations and continents have set themselves, development through economic growth. I say development. By that I mean bringing each and every African to full worth. It is about mankind. To be faithful to this vision of one of the founding fathers of African unity, our aim must be not just to seek higher growth rates, but to ground more firmly our strategy for growth in an ethical reflection on the social goods which we want this growth to deliver. We must endeavour to define the kind of growth that is best able to bring about the basic goods necessary for our citizens to lead a good, decent life. Here in Africa, as in Ireland, our simple project must not only be about the right to survive, but about the right to flourish. And in that regard, I was very interested to read UNICA's 2013 economic report, Making the Most of Africa's Commodities, Industrializing for Growth, Jobs and Economic Transformation, which offers a very stimulating reflection on global value change and the new opportunities with which they present Africans. That report convincingly argues that the way for Africa to achieve inclusive economic growth is to develop effective industrial policies and commodity-based industrialization. Indeed, the vast shifts in global production and trade patterns mean that new possibilities have emerged for connecting to global economic actors and for adding value to locally produced commodities in a manner that fosters economic diversification, job creation, and socio-economic development. Private companies and the big investors that control global value change cannot be relied on to promote local linkages and interactions beyond their own interests. African governments therefore need, the report suggests, to make strategic interventions to empower indigenous firms to insert themselves in regional and global value change. And it would be extraordinary if they were opposed in doing so, seeing that the existing developed world has precisely used such strategies for their infant industries in their time. And this report also asserts the benefits of regional cooperation and the need to develop regional markets, which may initially be less demanding, and thus allow local firms opportunities to build the production capabilities required to move up into more competitive global change. To some extent, one could say that the ability of the Irish government to strategically insert the Irish economy in emerging global value chains from the mid-1990s onwards, coupled with access to the single European market, are factors which underpinned Ireland's healthy economic development before our economy was engulfed in a credit-led speculative property bubble. An aberration in what I would suggest was a real economic development. We can well imagine where Africa will be, when it will manage to effectively harness cooperation between its regional economic communities to boost the level of inter-African trade and to add value locally to its own commodities for the primary benefit of its citizens. All this, of course, can happen only if African governments individually and in concert within the African Union and other fora for regional cooperation can deliver on the aspirations for peace and security of their citizens. It is also crucial to recall that peace and stability will not be achieved on this continent and global lest we tackle head-on the terrible predicament of millions of men, women and children who are forced to leave behind their homes, communities and means of survival to seek refuge elsewhere. This is an issue that must concern us all, and not just the countries first affected and their immediate neighbours. Ethiopia has a history of receiving people displaced by cross-border movements due to droughts, conflicts, political events, and civil wars in neighboring countries, including Eritrea, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. And I want to pay tribute to the government of Ethiopia for maintaining its open door policy and having continuously allowed humanitarian access and protection to those seeking refuge on its territory. Today, this country is home to a population of over 600,000 refugees, which are mainly accommodated in camps distributed across the Ethiopian territory, including Dala-Ado, Shire, Gambela, and Asosa. And may I also commend the extremely important work carried out by the Ethiopian Refugee Agency, the Administration for Refugee and Returnee Affairs, ARA, who is the UNHCR's main governmental partner in Ethiopia, and also to the patient mediation efforts led by the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. These agencies and the NGO workers involved on the ground are performing incredible tasks in the most difficult circumstances. For example, I know that the plight of Eritrean refugees, in particular those unaccompanied minors and children who are separated from their families and who tend to move on to third countries, presents a major challenge for those who endeavour to provide them with appropriate protection. Yesterday I travelled to Gambela, where I met many amazing people. First and foremost, the refugees themselves. It is they who are bearing the worst of the consequences of the ongoing conflict in South Sudan. They are doing so with stoicism. But I was moved and worried to see it might also be with fatalism. But they are doing so with dignity and courage. This conflict which has driven them across the border is most dispiriting. After all that has been involved in bringing the world's newest state into being, the people who expected so much from their own independence have frankly been let down. In Ireland, as in many African countries, we know what it means to move from a war of independence to a civil war. Our own war of independence was followed immediately by a bitter civil war, which sapped much of our energy and talents, and for years, even generations. My own country's history, and sadly the war in South Sudan today, remind us that achieving independence is far from being the end of the journey. The requirements of democracy, the need to accommodate the rights of minorities, are challenges that are even more demanding, and we must all do our best to support all those efforts that are seeking a sustainable peace process in South Sudan. Faced with the enormous scale of the refugee problem, globally, Europe cannot be content with its current management of migration flows. We should never forget that European countries developed themselves in previous centuries by sending millions of their own people to other continents. And what would have happened to the Irish people had they been denied the possibility to emigrate to the New World in order to escape starvation at home in the mid-19th century? The current situation, which sees migration to rich countries close to blocked, leaving so many with no other option than to cross the Mediterranean, our Mare Nostrum turned mass graveyard in highly perilous circumstances. This situation is a moral scandal. There can be no resolution to this defining issue of our times without a sharing of responsibilities, instead of what Pope Francis has described as the current globalization of indifference. Finally, the most immediate challenge to the stability of this continent is, of course, the Ebola crisis, which is devastating parts of West Africa. I am, like everybody here, horrified by the tragic loss of life. And on behalf of the Irish people, I want to pay tribute to the courageous health workers, doctors and nurses who have responded and who I know will respond, and who are battling to contain the virus. But we must do more. We must do more, for example, to support the efforts of the African Union's support to Ebola outbreak in West Africa. I know, Dr. Lopez, that you have just returned from the region, having visited the worst affected areas with the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the chairperson of the African Union, Dr. Zuma. The focus you are applying to finding solutions to this terrible crisis is appreciated far and wide, beyond the region and beyond the continent. We should all be ready to work with you to find the answers the afflicted countries need, for it is essential that every possible effort is put in place to get a grip with the virus before it threatens the prosperity that Africa has begun to enjoy over the last few decades. We should recognize very clearly that Ebola is a disease that thrives on poverty. Indeed, the conditions that facilitate the tragic spread of the disease are underpinned by poor health services, migration from rural areas that are unable to sustain the livelihoods of an expanding population, which in turn feeds anarchic urban development and overcrowded housing conditions in so many quarters of Africa's booming cities. South Africans sometimes talk of what they call Ubuntu, a concept which describes our interconnectedness with other human beings, our community, our environment, the wider world, future generations. This is not a moment to succumb to fear and an instinct for any self-preservation which would put at risk the great hopes, the economic and social progress that has been underway for over a decade across the African continent. This is a moment when we need to embrace a local, regional and global Ubuntu, a moment to show solidarity between Africans and with Africans. Ladies and gentlemen, the various challenges I have mentioned all have economic, social, political, cultural and moral ramifications. Tackling them requires a collective effort, not just from Africans but from the rest of the world too. The taking of a freedom to imagine new models of social, economic and cultural development for our shared future. By this time next year, the world's leaders will have adopted a new set of global development goals. The United Nations have appointed Ireland and Kenya to co-facilitate the international negotiations on the new global development agenda. This leadership role is both a great honour and a huge challenge for Ireland. But I can assure you that we will do our best to foster an agenda that is both faithful to the greatest hopes of those founding fathers of African independence and unity that I quoted, and it also will be responsive to the requirements of our acknowledged interdependence in this new century. As we say in Irish, to conclude, the characters staring at us from Afawerk, Tekle, stained glass, triptych when I came in, the total liberation of Africa. That work that overlooks the staircase behind you reminds us of the spirit which animated the founding fathers 50 years ago. Ramatoulaye, the leading character in Mariana Ba's So Long a Letter, is another powerful voice who recalls for us the excitement of those years of liberation. Let me quote her words. It was the privilege of our generation to be the link between two periods in our history, one of domination, the other of independence. We remained young and efficient, for we were the messengers of a new design. Now it is the privilege of another generation to be the link between two periods in our shared history. I like to think of them all, past and present, as pilgrims, with each pilgrimage representing a different chapter in the story of a continent on the move. As this new generation takes on the mantle of transformation and change, my hope is that they retain the utopian, emancipatory charge of Afawerk Tekle's work of art, while perhaps discarding the word total from its title, which is too redolent of the darkest passions of the 20th century. Indeed, in our interconnected and complicated world, cooperation, the pooling of resources, a recognition of our interdependence, offer so much more secure and fruitful grounds for our mutual relations than any absolutist version of sovereignty. In the decades to come, then, Africans are invited to find a singular voice, a voice of freedom, but also a voice of fidelity to their rich history and traditions. In the very long term, in the multi-secular temporal horizon, which is that of Lucy, we are all but migrants in time and space, transient travelers who must do our best to pass on to the next generations a hospitable ground on which they might flourish. Thank you.